Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Deviant Mind. My name is Dominika.
And my name is Chris.
And we have quite the wild story for you today. We are doing the disappearance and then reappearance and subsequent prosecution of Sherri Papini, which is your typical beautiful blonde white woman case that turns totally nuts.
Yes.
Did you know?
Speak volumes to the fact that our society seems to gravitate towards attractive blonde women who go missing. And then meanwhile, there are Native American women missing. There are people of color that are missing, but they don't get as much attention as Sherri Papini or some other cases.
Of the other women. And we're not saying that these women don't deserve to be found. They do, but the amount of media attention that they get is quite astonishing compared to other women who go missing every day. And this woman was quite the kicker. So we, instead of typically what we do is we talk about the victim, but this time we're actually going to start with the case itself. And then we uncover who Sherri was, because I hope this isn't a spoiler, but Sherri is not the victim. She's the perpetrator.
However, there were other victims greatly affected by her behavior and her actions.
Absolutely.
So that's what's interesting is there are lots of victims that believed her.
Yeah. And then also I actually, in my research, found out that she had made posts on MySpace again in the early 2000s that was talking about like white people and skinheads. So there's definitely like a whole racist thing that goes along with this case as well. That was pretty disturbing. But
once again, we have another case here where race plays a role. And she apparently she was bigoted towards the Latino community and Latinos. And just another case where it's easy to blame someone of color because of this kind of sick thinking that the society will believe it.
Yeah, exactly. And the stories that she came up with, her supposed abductors, were racist in and of themselves. And then, she took up a lot of resources, which is, as we'll find out, is one of the reasons why she went to jail. So,
and also, in effect, I was just going to throw out there that the Latino community is another victim of this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know if they've ever actually had any, I guess, not reparations, but apologies to the Latino community because this community for years, because this wasn't solved for years. And so the Latino community was under suspicion because of the descriptions that she gave to the police of her abductors.
And we can't forget the fact that this was during the Trump era.
Yes.
This was when Trump is in office, and we remember how he felt about immigrants and people of color coming into our country. So I think his supporters hear a story like this, and it just gives them more ammunition to say, this is why we can't have people from other countries.
More fear, because it essentially is fear of the other, quote unquote. And this, as we said, started in 2016. So at 5:50 p.m., Keith Papini, which was Sherri Papini's husband, came home from work on November 2nd, 2016, and found his wife and kids missing from their home in the Mountain Gate area of Shasta County near Redding, California. And this is in Northern California. That is near Redding, which is north of Sacramento, I believe. He called the daycare where his kids were and found that they had not been picked up by his 34-year-old wife, Sherri Papini, and this was totally out of the norm because she was known as a super mom. He checked his Find My iPhone app and located Sherri's iPhone, and he went there. It was only like less than a mile away. When he got there, he found her iPhone and earbuds with blonde hairs entangled in them on the south corner of Sunrise Drive and the Old Oregon Trail. And they were about 2 feet off the road. And so this is, of course, when he called the police. However, he thought that the iPhone was placed in its position, not really thrown, and said that it was pretty weird. When the sheriff's department came, they, of course, looked over the crime scene. They did a walk through the Papini home, and they found no sign of struggle. They didn't find anything missing. Sherri's purse and jewelry were accounted for. And when questioned, Keith had no idea if there had been any unusual banking activity in Sherri's bank accounts. So when they interviewed some of the neighbors, they said that they had seen Sherri jogging and that it looked like she went missing between 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. in like this 2-hour window. And the detectives at first, they of course interviewed Keith, because typically when a wife goes missing, he's the first person to be interviewed. Said that their marriage was fine and they got into arguments like other married people do. And he said that Sherri could easily push his buttons. And so the moment the media found out that Sherri had disappeared, whole kind of media machine came out. So I have a timeline. So Sherri was missing for 22 days. So I have a timeline of everything that kind of happened with the media and the family and the community, then what the police were doing during this time as well. So we're going to first go through, again, the kind of media circus that happens. Yeah. And then we can go through and talk about what the police were doing in the investigation. So,
as a couple of quick side notes, she had been preparing for a marathon. This is why she said that she jogged every morning, tries to stay in good shape. An officer at the time said, with regards to the cell phone and the lock of hair, as we'll later find out, she says that was her way of letting anyone who would find it know that it was her. That's her DNA, and it's her. But the cop pointed out, if you're being abducted, it's fight or flight, and you wouldn't have the wherewithal to remove a piece of your hair, place the phone down, put down the headphones, and then get into this van forcibly.
Right, exactly. And then I also read an article stating that she had just gotten recently breast implants and she was so excited to be able to go running because she was finally given the okay to do that as well.
And that comes up again, her breast implants.
Yes. Yeah. So she went missing on November 2nd. On November 3rd, they had search and rescue teams from the sheriff's office comb through the area of Sunrise Drive and Old Oregon Trail. The California Highway Patrol was assisting with an aerial search for her. Patrol deputies and detectives began making checks to 290 registered sex offenders who lived in the area. And Sherri Papini's sister, Sheila Coaster, went to the media and said that the family really believed she had been abducted. So that was the day after she went missing. On November 4th, which was the next day, a secret witness of Shasta County announced a $10,000 reward for information, and volunteers from community groups showed up at the Papini home to help in the search. So now the community is getting into this search. November 5th, the next day, family members add $40,000 to the reward, bringing the total up to $50,000. 2 days later, the family refocuses their search efforts to get the attention of national news organizations and social media networks. So they're like, okay, we're gonna make this story go national. And of course, it does very quickly. It went around the world. Now, on November 9th, which is a couple days later, Sheriff's Lieutenant Anthony Bertain announced that Keith Papini was not a person of interest in the case. He passed a lie detector test, which lie detector tests don't really, they're not worth anything, as we know, but they did not have any physical evidence linking him to her disappearance.
Yeah, and by all accounts, he really did love her. Incidentally, he was her first kiss back in 7th grade. So there was like a lot of history between the two. And the fact that he was heavily involved in trying to locate her and always on television and always pleading for assistance. Usually if the suspect, the husband, boyfriend is involved, they shy away. But I thought that was really interesting. In other words, he was sincere and honest in his quest to find out. She was.
Absolutely. Unlike Brian Walsh, which we talked about like several, or at least I did the episode like 4 episodes ago about him.
Oh, I got to stick this in. Also, during his Keith's interrogations, did you kill your wife? No. He just says no. Whereas in this present Alex Murdaugh case, they released this new interrogation video where, did you kill your wife? His response is, no way no way I killed my wife, Maggie. Did you kill your son? No way I killed my son, Paul. And if you remove the no way, you have the admission. I killed my wife, Maggie. I killed my son, Paul. Because the common response is no, and you get angry. I would never have anything to do with that.
And you don't repeat.
Yeah, all
exactly.
Going to show that Keith is very honest.
And then also, going back to the Murdaugh case, which we did just a couple weeks ago. Did you see that they actually came up with evidence that the son and the wife had found his stash of pills a month before they died? So apparently maybe he did have a pill addiction, which I know in that episode we were like, did he not?
Yeah.
But we should do, maybe this is our next week's episode, we do a follow-up on the Murdaugh case, because that should be the end of the court case, right? Because it's on week 3 right now. So we'll do a follow-up on the Murdaugh case for all the new stuff that came out on the next episode. I think that would be a good thing, because there's been lots that has come out. But anyway, back to Sherri Papini. So she's still missing. And on November 13th, 2016, the family hires a private investigator to help them search for her, because now they're like, we don't know what the cops are doing. And now it's getting more and more, because we've all seen the documentaries being like the first 24 hours are the most important, like being able to find them as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
On November 15th, 2016, Sheila Koester and Keith Papini, they attended the Reading City Council meeting to thank supporters and announce that they will release balloons at a future date to get Sherri Papini's face around the world, which, by the way, it was already around the world. And several days later, an anonymous person set up a website, www.sherripapini.com, to offer an undisclosed ransom for Sherri Papini's immediate release, setting a deadline of 5 a.m. Wednesday, November 23rd. And a letter provided instruction to the person who has Sherri Papini and named Cameron Gamble as the middleman. And Gamble who himself described himself as a kidnap and ransom consultant and was connected to Bethel Church's missions. And he says he was acting independently from law enforcement and family, which again, circus is full on in here.
Yeah.
And the sheriff, Tom Basenko, said that there was still not enough evidence to classify the disappearance as an abduction, and cautioned the approach could make the family a target of scam artists, because, again, there's a whole investigation going on while this public face of the case is happening. We'll go into, and they were definitely seeing a lot of red flags.
Yeah.
And then on November 20th, the sheriff's department had to come out and being like, listen, we are doing a lot of interviews. We've served more than 20 search warrants, and they had received about 400 tips. November 22nd, which is 2 days later, this man, Gamble, said that he believed the purported abductors are still in decision-making mode, which sounds like he's in contact with them somehow. But meanwhile, Rod Rodriguez, who is Keith Papini's stepfather, warns on Facebook that if the deadline expires without information, the money will turn into a reward after the deadline passes. And then Gamble declines to say how much the alleged abductor would receive, but says a tipster who helps get Sherri Papini home safely will receive a 6-figure reward. And strangely enough, on November 23rd, Gamble, who is again the kidnap and ransom consultant, he posted a new video saying the ransom had been withdrawn and the money would be combined with the $50,000 reward previously posted. This is November 23rd. November 24th, very early in the morning, is when Sherri Papini is found. So we're going to go back now to what the Shasta County Sheriff's Department was doing while this kind of media abduction train was happening. They had asked the FBI to come in and help them find Sherri. And as we said before, there was extensive searches that were conducted all over Shasta County and the nearby states. And I think they needed the FBI for the nearby states because you can't go out of your jurisdiction. And when Sherri's iPhone was analyzed, the detectives found 2 phone numbers stored under women's names that belonged to 2 different men. I found the probable cause affidavit for her arrest in 2020. And so they did not go into who these men were. They just called them Man 1 and Man 2. Man 1, Sherri and him were having a conversation on November 1st, 2016, which was again the day before she disappeared. They had discussed meeting in Reading, and when the police found the travel records for man one, they found that he traveled to San Francisco on October 28th, 2016, and then went back to Michigan on November 2nd, which was the day of Sherri's disappearance. So this was enough for the investigators to travel to Michigan to talk to this man and to see if Sherri was with him. Now, they didn't find Sherri, but he told them everything that he knew, and said that they had met in 2011 at an out-of-town of work event and spent the weekend together, which, reading between the lines, sounds like Sherri had cheated on her husband. They were already married at that time. And they kept up flirtatious text messages throughout the years. And even though man one, no, this was somebody completely different. This was not an ex-boyfriend. This was
this
just
an online gamer guy? Also like an online gamer dude that she just happens to meet. They befriend each other, and I think that's when she's that.
So yes, that must be the online gamer guy, because there was a man too, and that they had been a couple through I think a church group. So this must have been the online gamer dude, and they. Even though he was planning to meet her on this trip, that they never connected. And then man number two was a former ex-boyfriend. He had met Sherri around 2000, 2001 at a Friday Night Live youth program and dated her for several years. And he said that when he was interviewed by the police, he did not hold back, that Sherri was an attention-hungry person who told stories to get people's attention, that she'd fabricated stories of being the victim of abuse from her family, father, and then him when they broke up. And on November 16th, 2016, the investigators spoke to the director of the Friday Night Live youth program, who knew Sherri back then, and said this person stated that they actually feared having Sherri in the program because this was a direct quote, was good at creating different realities for people so that they would see what she wanted them to see, which got her really good attention. So the cops are all of a sudden being like, oh my gosh, who is this woman? So you have this whole media circus of, oh my God, innocent mother disappeared. And meanwhile, they're like starting to find some strange things.
Yes.
Now, they also discovered that she had been married previously, which is totally fine, to a man that they called man number 3, and he was in the military. And the mother, and was it the mother? They supposedly, so the first information they got was that they got married so Sherri could have health insurance because she had a heart murmur issue.
Correct. And she donated a lot of her eggs.
That was the story she told the husband number one, that she had donated a lot of eggs and she was having complications due to that. Elle said that she had a heart murmur issue. I don't know if those two were connected. But then there was also stories that were not complete. So Sherri's mother said that Sherri traveled the world with this first husband. The husband, however, was like, we got married right before I deployed. We never lived together. We never traveled together. She did visit me once in Japan. But that was pretty much it. And then she's, hey, I need a divorce because I met somebody else. And he was like, sure, great. But he said in his testimony that he had heard from her friends that she had a history of lying. So the police were like, okay, let's go talk to some of her friends. And when they found the friends, they were like, she was crazy and wild as a youth. She had run away from home a lot, actually ran away to Southern California when she was 16 to stay with friends. Also stated that Sherri would make up lies, particularly about being the victim of abuse, especially as a youth.
As a youth, around 18, she was also very close friends with, and I don't know her last name, but a girl named Tara. And they used to really always hang out a lot. What's interesting is that Tara was abducted and never found, and basically became a cold case. And Sherri knew her and knew the family. So when they found out that she was missing, Tara's family was just heartbroken, be like, I can't believe this is happening. She was like so close to the family. We lose our daughter, now Sherri's gone.
Oh my gosh.
That's also weird and crazy.
We know, and I wonder if she then knew what kind of circus would happen with an abduction of a girl. That's even worse. So as they were doing this, November 24th came around, and at approximately 4:30 a.m., the California Highway Patrol 19 responded to several 911 calls made regarding a woman who turned out to be Sherri, standing or running in the middle of Interstate 5, which is I-5 it goes all the way from Mexico to Canada. in fact. And so the CHP, California Highway Patrol officer, found Sherri with a truck driver along I-5 near Woodland, California in Yolo County, which is approximately 146 miles south of the location of her disappearance. She, at the time, had a chain around her waist that one arm was bound to. She had additional bindings around her other wrist and each ankle. She was immediately transported to Woodland Hospital, where she underwent several physical examinations. And she appeared to have lost a considerable amount of weight. Long blonde hair had been cut much shorter. She had been branded on her right shoulder, although the exact content of the brand was hard to read. Her nose was swollen. She had bruises on her face, rashes on her left arm and left upper inner thigh, as well as other parts of her body. She had ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, burns on her left forearm, and bruising on her pelvis and the fronts of both legs. When the toxicology results came back, they did not find any significant traces of narcotics, nor did the physical exam show that she had been sexually assaulted. So when they found her, after they got her into the ambulance, they wanted to essentially interview her. And she refused to speak to the sheriff's detectives. And so what they did was they gave the audio recorder to her husband, Keith, and he was the one who asked Sherri questions. Now, the detectives remained with the couple. So they rode along in the ambulance and they stayed in her room at the hospital, but the husband was the one who was asking her the questions. And it was recorded in its entirety. And she had, this is where things get a little funky. So she stated that she had been kidnapped by two Hispanic women. And she was able to, before I go into the women, I should state, because this becomes important later, when they took her clothes, they had everything analyzed and they found DNA in her underwear that was a male contributor DNA material. And this is going to become important later because at the time...
And they kept it under wraps, like the FBI...
And they kept it under wraps. Yeah, they kept it under wraps. So this DNA was found in 2016, and that becomes her downfall in 2020. So then going back to who she said abducted her, she said that two Hispanic women abducted her, that there was an older one and a younger one. They were Hispanic. They spoke Spanish a lot, end quote. She said that the Hispanic women always wore masks and short black leather gloves. And she described the older woman as being really mean, and the younger one seemingly she didn't entirely wanted to be involved. She said that the younger woman was smaller with curly, long brown hair, and she spoke more Spanish. She described the older woman as taller and fat, had straight, dark or black hair with gray in it, and a raspy voice. And this is coming straight from the affidavit. Sherri also stated that her abductors always wore masks, and sometimes they wore different colored bandanas, and then they sometimes wore lace masks.
Yeah.
And she said that, again, her story kind of changes, becomes bigger, has more details. She said that she had a hard time remembering all the details.
Yeah.
And so she couldn't really describe the clothing that they wore, or that there was, I guess, they wore hats and she couldn't remember the words on the hat.
Yeah.
And so she claimed that as she was jogging, a dark colored SUV containing the two Hispanic women first drove past her, then backed up when they saw her jogging up the road. One of the women had on sunglasses, and Sherri said that she said, quote, "Can you help me?" So Sherri walked towards the woman, who opened the door of the vehicle to show Sherri that she had a gun.
Yeah.
And Sherri described it as a little revolver. Then the woman told Sherri to put her phone down. So that's Sherri did. And Sherri claimed that the woman said something to the effect of, "We don't want to kill you." And then Sherri put her phone down, got into the SUV, and the SUV had tinted windows and either no seats or one seat on the far side and a hump that went up around. And again, this is just, she claims that it took her to an apartment where they kept her. They played all that weird Hispanic music, she said, which she was extremely rude about. And then she tells this like crazy story of all the abuse she suffered. Now, supposedly she claimed that The reason why she didn't want to talk to the sheriff's department was that the women had said that she was going to be sold into sex slavery and she was going to get sold to a cop.
Yeah. Which is why she figured, oh, this is why they're branding me. I'm being branded for this cop. I'm going to be the cops.
Right. Exactly. And so the police and the FBI took her story and said, okay, they had sketches created of these two women.
Yeah.
Obviously, the community, like Hispanic women all through the community, were really scared to be like taken off the street if they matched this description.
And there was a lot of bigotry and racism towards the Latino community at that time. Again, Trump era, and it was really easy to be like, how dare you take that woman? And they obviously have nothing to do with it. But just the extraordinary way, which I'm sure you're about to get to, that she was able to return is crazy. Also, let us point out that usually once a missing person hasn't returned after say 18, 20 days, you think the worst.
It's 22.
22, but around that time, you start thinking the worst if they haven't returned. For the most part, you're
absolutely.
like, okay, we have to brace ourselves for the possibility our loved one is dead because she hasn't come home.
Exactly. And the affidavit was really detailed into the story that she created, but I'm not even sure if we really should go into that because it was all made up.
It was all made up.
It was all made up.
She escaped. She heard a gunshot. And then the other one
she was branded. Yeah, she was branded because she tried to escape once through a window.
Yeah. I was just going to say what's really funny is by hearing that she's going to be sold to a cop, she sets that up as to later when the cops interrogate and interview her, it's very hard for her. She doesn't know who to trust in the authorities because a cop bought her. So that's the other thing. It's like, okay, now we understand why it's so hard for her to talk to us. She was told that a cop bought her. So it's just, it's like a defense. Like, you may not believe me, but it's only because I have this trust in you now that I was sold to a cop.
Exactly. And then she had a story for every single piece of bruise or whatever thing on her body. Like from the affidavit, again, she was saying that she had zip ties off her wrists and she broke them off. And so this is what this little scar is from. This is where like the wrists were. And
so in the affidavit, I was just going to say, are you going to get into, I didn't know if you wanted to discuss that first police interview at her house with Keith.
I know she freaked out and said she didn't want to talk to them. And she kept going back and forth. He had to be in the room with her at all times.
Her body language extraordinarily weird. And she tells the cops, forgive me, while I'm talking, I really need to close my eyes. Allowing them not to see her reaction or eye contact to tell what's going on. Again, she's just trying to cover her tracks for like all her weird behavior and not wanting to cooperate. And then telling them, oh, I'm used to these shows. I watch all these shows. That's what gave me the idea to leave the phone with the hair. Oh, and I've also read Elizabeth Smart's book. Now, when you read Elizabeth Smart's book, she was kept in a closet with a bucket or whatever to go to the bathroom. She was chained. Mm-hmm. That's what Sherri says happened to her. Then also in the Elizabeth Smart book was something about, there was something else in this book that basically she said also happened to her. So like she took all these little excerpts from Elizabeth Smart's book and said it happened to her.
Yeah, she also said that about the zip ties, that her and her husband had watched YouTube videos on how to get rid of the zip ties. So that's what she was trying to do when she was in a captivity, to try to get rid of them. So again, the story was like, how can you tell? And I don't think any police officer or FBI agent's going to be like, oh my God, this woman's lying. Because obviously she has all of these marks on her. She's telling a story, and you're always going to want to believe the victim.
The breast implants come back into play as during the interview session, she just happens to mention the cops. They were pulling me and it hurting. Well, I have these breasts. I have breast implants. As a way of like shifting, now they're going to think about her breasts. And when she says this in the video, Keith kind of just gives her this look. And it's obvious. Here are the two male cops interviewing me. Let me talk about my breasts. You'll forget about this for a second.
About the other stuff. Exactly. So it's like, I'm just gonna, And again, her story. And so they, of course, never found these Hispanic women. So now this all of a sudden becomes an open case. And she got quite a bit of money from the Victims Fund in California,
A
which is
lot.
one of the reasons why it was actually around $30,000, which is what she went to jail for. And she took up a lot of
40,000
resources.
came through GoFundMe.
Yeah, and exactly, the GoFundMe. And then she was in constant contact with the sheriff's department and the FBI. So they were like, so she was in therapy, or each time there was a time where they went to Oregon to some sort of like shop, and she was like, oh, that's the revolver. I recognize the revolver. So they call up the FBI and say it was this type of revolver.
Yeah.
And then they were in a room where the paneling was similar to the beadboard. So the husband contacted the FBI with photographs.
Mm-hmm.
She was now like perpetrating this story this is now 5-6 months later. And this happened for the next 2 years. So there's in the affidavit, there's so many instances of, okay, this is what the revolver looks like. They had a photo lineup where they did for the older woman with the bushy, thick eyebrows and the younger woman with curly hair. They had her come in and see if she could pick them out of the lineup, which she could not. Then they did another sketch artist to create the renderings. And this was on June 22nd, 2017. They're still looking for these Hispanic ladies. Then they had sketch artists create sample mask images. And this was like so much work that she was doing. Then they had to approve the sketches, go back and forth.
Yeah.
Now, when she started going into therapy, she started having memories of a black coffee table with a granite veneer or a laminate top that was cracked. And she was saying how she was lying face down. So she was all of a sudden getting all these extra memories that she didn't have when they originally interviewed her.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this went on and they were contacting the FBI in 2018 with this. And meanwhile, the cops, because this is a cold case, they're like, okay, we have this DNA.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, everybody is putting DNA into ancestry.com and all of these on-site places where the cops can essentially see if they can find family of DNA that they find. So on September,
one thing that led them to do that, and just the crack that started unfolding and having everyone suspicious of her, really, was when she told the story, they were going to sell me to a cop. And then at one point during some interview or interrogation, they said, did they speak Spanish? And she was like, yeah. And they asked her, you're from California. Do you understand any Spanish? And she said, no. And they're like, how did you know that they're going to sell you to a cop? And then she dipped back into, I'm not feeling well.
And she said, oh, wait a minute.
Major slip. They spoke Spanish, yet she was able to understand.
But she was able to understand that was a huge slip.
So then they're like, let's look at this DNA.
Let's look at this DNA. So on September 26, 2019, the Sheriff's Department detective submitted a letter to the California DOJ requesting a familial DNA search for an unknown male DNA contributor that was found in this underwear. And on March 19th, 2020, so now this is 6 months later, the California DOJ Familial Search Committee voted to release a familiar search result to provide analytical assistance to find it. And they had said that they found a potential relative of the unknown male DNA. And this person had 2 living biological sons. And one of those biological sons was an ex-boyfriend of Sherri.
Yep.
And so now they start an investigation. So this is 2020. So this is 2.5 years later.
Yeah.
And they found out that this DNA for this ex-boyfriend, he was associated with an address that was owned by Sherri's parents. They also found out that this ex-boyfriend and Sherri were joint subscribers to an American online email account, and that they actually had financial transactions together. So they went through the ex-boyfriend's brother's social media pages, and they found a table similar in appearance to the table that Sherri described that she had been strapped and branded on.
Yes.
So on June 9th, 2020, FBI special agents collected discarded items from a trash can outside of this ex-boyfriend's residence in Costa Mesa. It was a Honest Honey green tea bottle that they actually were able to take the DNA And the DNA was a match to the DNA in Sherri's clothing. So on August the 10th, 2020, they interviewed this ex-boyfriend and he told them the entire story.
The entire story.
Which he said that he helped Sherri run away, quote unquote.
Yeah.
That she was a good friend and she asked him for help. And she said that her husband was beating and raping her and she was trying to escape.
Let's keep in mind that they don't get to that point 2.5 years later if it weren't for the relentless wanting of information and the capture of these women by her husband. That's the irony. Like her mom, who she also accused of being abused by, her husband, who she's both of them are like hounding the cops. We got to find who abducted my wife.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually there was something that happened during 2018 that the family were really unhappy about. But the Sacramento Bee had uncovered 911 calls from her mother saying that Sherri was cutting herself and saying that it was her mother was abusing her. So she called 911 to figure out what in the world she should do about it. Her sister also said around that time that she had broken down her back door trying to get in, and that she also accused her father of, I think of assaulting her as well. So this was 911. And then the family came out, like, you're blaming the victim. How dare you do this? But again, this woman has obviously mental health issues that started at a pretty young age of seeing how much attention she could get from being a victim of abuse, which has obviously worked for her up until this point. And she said that she had filed police reports against her husband, but that the police were not doing anything to stop her. So she had something planned and she had to escape, which, by the way, if she's getting abused, why is she leaving her 2 little kids that were like 5 and 3 behind with an abusive husband? This ex-boyfriend knew that she was married with 2 young kids.
You take your kids with you.
Right. Like, why would you? But he said that he had known her since they were 13 and 14 years old, that they had been lifelong friends. They had a romantic relationship and they had been engaged. Yeah. And he just really wanted to help her.
Yeah.
So he actually told them the way that they had reconnected is that he had found a box of some of her belongings. He sent it to her parents' house, called the parents, and then she reached out. She, as he said, quote, she laid out the situation. And so they got prepaid phones to communicate. And so they concocted this whole plan. He rented a car, drove, because he lived in Southern California, drove up to Redding, picked her up at a location, which, by the way, she was so sneaky that she actually sent him a care package because he had been in a hospital. Yes. She sent him a care package that had the location and the time and date inside of when he should pick her up. And so he did exactly that. He said that he gave her like a pic of the bedrooms, that she stayed with him for 22 days, that they only talked and were friends. And he said that she had created all of those marks on her body herself. Yeah.
She never left the house.
She never left the house.
She stopped eating as much.
Yep. It stopped, exactly. And
got the rash from cleaning the house, apparently.
That's right. And he also said she asked me to help her give her big bruises. He's like, I didn't lay my hands on her, but she like had me throw a puck at, I guess, a hockey puck at her leg, so she could create a bruise. And then she decided when it was time for her to go home. And so they put her in this getup, and he dropped her off in the middle of the night. So on the highway.
She's let me out here.
Yes, exactly. And she said she missed her children and wanted to go home. And she said, quote, I'm ready to go home. So they rented a car. Actually, he had a friend of his rent a car for him. So he must have knew he was doing something shady, because he must have, here's the thing. He must have seen the news because it was everywhere.
They apparently were both watching the news while she was over at his house. She watched videos of her husband and her mom, and he knew, and he was like, look, you can't go out. Like, you got to stay here. And it was just one of these things where he wanted to do anything. He heard those earlier lies from the past where she claimed she was abused by her mom. And then I think in his head, once he hears, oh, now she's being abused by the husband, I got to. Now he claims they never had sexual relations.
That is correct.
They may have spooned, they may have snuggled, which is, so basically the DNA, I'm sorry to say pubic hair, but the DNA on the underwear was most likely not from sexual intercourse, had nothing to do with sex, which is interesting.
Exactly. It was interesting. And again, she had also all of those things that she had created were all in his apartment. So they found a table.
In the bathroom. On the
crack in the bathroom. Yeah. There was the lag bolt in the closet where she was supposedly chained up to.
Yeah.
And again, he keeps saying, I just wanted to help an old friend, but this seems so elaborate. And with all of the news coverage of what was happening and the fact that she's like hurting herself and that they put a chain on her so to look like she had escaped. And his entire story was corroborated by AT&T records and by his cousin saying, he wouldn't let anybody into the house. All the parts and pieces of his apartment that she had used in her stories. So it was all pretty corroborated. And
when he tells the cops, she said, I'm ready to go home. I really miss my kids. And he says, it's Thanksgiving. Are you serious?
Yeah.
And she's like, get me home. So there's that whole thing. It's a miracle on Thanksgiving. She comes home. Oh my God. And now society and media are just like, wow, incredible.
Yeah. And I think she must have read too many serial killer books because that's always, you get the person who's going to survive come up on a major holiday. So each time the holiday comes around, they're back in the news again, right?
Yeah.
So here's the Christmas miracle.
Yes.
So what got her really in trouble is on August 13th, 2020, she had an interview with an FBI agent and a sheriff's department detective that they interviewed her. And they sat her in the interview, and their interview was recorded and transcribed. And at the beginning of the interview, they say, quote, all we want is truthful statements because it's a crime to lie to federal officers. Understood? And she said she understood. And instead of telling the truth, she went back to her story of the two Hispanic ladies, the younger one and the older one, being nice and abusive. And she stuck to her original story. And when they showed her the coffee table found in the ex-boyfriend's house, she said,
that's it. Oh my God, you found them? Oh my God, that's the table. And her husband's in the room, mind you. Her husband's there for as long as he can take it, but he's so excited. When you watch this video and she sees the table and she's, oh my God, yes. And then he's, oh my God, we got them. And then what happened?
Well, and then what happened? But then she also tried to scurry into it. She's like, it's a little bit different, but it's pretty similar, but it's a little different. And she kept going back and forth, but she kept lying. She would not say that. And then when they said, hey, we found the DNA, we know that you were picked up. And she's like, no, that never happened. It was, when they asked her why she was saying it was not the ex-boyfriend, and she was like, because he loves me, we were friends, there's no way he would have abducted me.
Yeah.
And
by the way, they offered Keith every opportunity to leave. And they kept saying to Sherri, do you want to keep Keith in here? Like maybe there's some stuff that he shouldn't hear. It'd be easier for you to come forward. So basically letting her know, we're on to you. Like we know the story. Do you really want to put your husband through this? And so he stays for a bit, and he's actually like there, and like he starts getting really nervous. Like he doesn't understand why she's doubling down. She's basically doubling down on her lies.
Until he leaves the room.
Yes.
And then she admits, me and the ex-boyfriend did talk a little bit before, and that's a direct quote from the affidavit. Then there's another quote. When I went out of town for work, I talked with other guys. I made a mistake. I talked to other men I shouldn't have. And when they asked her how she talked to this ex-boyfriend, she's like, oh, it was my work cell phone, and that she made a mistake and she's horrible. But she kept saying, it can't be him. It can't be him.
We got to find her. We got to find her. And that was the other thing. That one girl, I don't want to arrest her. I'm not on press charges. She helped me escape.
Yeah.
And then they're like, there's no one. There's no one there.
And so she did not at any point throughout that interview disavow her statements that it was those two Hispanic women and not the ex-boyfriend who picked her up.
Stop.
And then, so this was, then they went for the GoFundMe campaign, how she got money from the GoFundMe campaign, and then how she went to the California Victim Compensation Board.
Yep.
And she got all of that money. And so she...
From what I understand, the GoFundMe money, incidentally, went to go pay for her bills, like her credit card bills and phone bills, from what I understand.
There you go. There it is.
Yeah.
So she was, she was arrested, and because she had so much they had so much evidence against her that she went to jail for perjury.
Yep.
And
owes the
and
money.
for stealing money.
Yeah, and she owes all that money.
And she owes all that money.
And how long did she get?
I'm trying to...
18 months.
18 months.
She'll be released early next year.
18 months. Her husband filed for divorce 2 days after her trial started. I believe, is her trial started or when she got arrested?
And the interesting part about that is apparently up to that point, a little before that point, even after this interrogation, he leaves the room, comes back in, he's stunned. They did continue to live under the same roof for a bit. I think perhaps maybe for the sake of the kids, who knows?
Yeah, that's also like, he's thinking, did this actually really happen to me? Did this happen to her? Could she have lied for the last 2.5 years?
Yeah.
Like, we had been in constant contact with FBI agents, and this was all just all made up. I could imagine as a significant other who loved their spouse being like, this isn't happening. Like, she hasn't made this whole thing up, has she? This is such...
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking as the husband, you would be at this point being like, have I been married for 13 years to this woman who is to have created such a false kidnapping and just for attention? Or I read online about what possible mental disorders she could have.
What did you find?
But there was one lady, it sounded a little funky, where she was saying that, hold on a second, let me see if I can find it.
Everyone uses the word rather narcissistic, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just more about attention, and there's some underlying mental condition. It's not just narcissism.
It sounds to me, and I am in no shape or form a therapist, just very interested in true crime. She sounds like having Munchausen syndrome. And I know Munchausen syndrome by proxy is when you try to get attention for having your sick kid.
Yeah.
But Munchausen is when just Munchausen syndrome yourself is when you're trying to get attention for yourself. Yes. Now, I know that typically it's getting attention from doctors because you're sick. But this is essentially getting attention from everybody saying you've been abused. So maybe there's like a syndrome that's similar to Munchausen syndrome that is within that scope. Yeah, or exactly. She actually believes it. Yeah, like I was thinking borderline personality disorder, but I'm sure there's a disorder out there that could bring the narcissistic portion, this need for attention, and then this whole thing about being abused. Like, where does somebody come from? Because that's
before all this. That comes before.
Yeah, that comes like when she was a teenager.
And
like the kind of damage that you do for victims, because if you're a victim that's saying you're being sexually abused by somebody or abused by somebody, and you get found out that you're lying, it just gives all those other people who don't believe actual sexual abuse victims, they give them like, there was that one girl who lied. So it affects so many other people outside of just, the person you're trying to destroy by saying that they abused you for whatever reason.
Oh, it's definitely, it's another case like our last episode where, and in Dahmer, again, there are just so many issues that involve race and gender, certainly these days, really belittled actual victims and what they go through and actual missing people. So I watched, just because I wanted to see how they would translate all this to a movie, but I watched, there's actually, I think it's a Lifetime movie I watched, Hope, the Sherri Papini story, Jamie King as Sherri Papini. And there are some great scenes, I have to say, like the whole scene of her and her ex-boyfriend meeting while she's jogging and the car pulls up. it's so nonchalant. It's funny. It's just, okay, all right, get in. Okay, wait, hold on. Let me pull out my hair. And these kind of funny things. But the one scene that really struck home was, in addition to going to therapy, I guess she attended some victim groups. And it's a great scene where you see like these women going around discussing their abuse and how they're overcoming it. And it just zooms in on her, and you get the sense like, oh shit, I should not be here. These are actual people.
Yeah, actual people. So I did find the article that I had found. This is from frontpagedetectives.com. And it's a woman who does have a bunch of, she is a board certified Beverly Hills forensic psychiatrist, expert witness who has had hundreds of criminal and civil cases. She's also written a lot of books, and she has a blog post, which I will link in the show notes, saying that she has needed treatment. This is a direct quote from the blog. Has needed treatment since childhood for what's called a mixed personality disorder, which includes antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic traits. And this whole blog post is actually comparing her to Amy from Gone Girl, the book that was made into a movie with Rosamund Pike and Ben Affleck.
I've heard that comparison too.
Yeah. And I've never heard of a mixed personality disorder, but this lady is a therapist. So maybe that is a thing, but it shows that she's manipulative and a volatile drama queen with an overactive imagination that is delusional. But the fact of how many, and we didn't go into the details of these stories that she told about these Hispanic women because they're not true and we do not want to perpetrate lies, but she was very specific about what they had done to her. And I did read some articles where some of that slipped out into the press. And again, can't be understated enough how much this community was under attack, especially in those early months where there were women who were like afraid to go out on the street because they were afraid they were going to get picked by the cops. And again, the cops are not exactly the greatest to people of color, and they do a lot of racial profiling. So I can't even imagine the kind of stress this community must have been under while the media was going after this, after she had been found and said it was to Hispanic women.
Yeah.
That is the case of Sherri Papini. And hopefully her kids are very far away from her and her husband is doing okay.
And he does have custody of the kids.
Thank goodness.
And I believe that her mom eventually did file some sort of suit for defamation or something, claiming I did nothing to you. And I've proved that you've been blaming me for a lot of things. And so I think that also played out in court.
Yeah. So it's a crazy case that, again, just one woman's need for attention or whatever she was going for just caused so many ripple effects in this community in such terrible way. And again, taking away victims' voices, like women not being believed, is a gigantic issue. There's absolutely, definitely, I don't think it's the Colleen Stan case, but it's the toy box killer, which is definitely an episode that we should definitely look into. But he had abducted women, and when the women came to the cops, they didn't believe them. And so when you have something like this happen, it always sticks out in somebody's mind. So there was that one woman who lied about it. And again, hopefully the ripple effects don't go. This was in 2020, but yeah, it was a strange case. And it was just, again, I just remember all of those shows being like, oh my God, there's a woman who's been abducted while she was jogging. Everybody don't jog.
Yeah, I remember that. It was really hot and heavy. And I think this case really shows that even by lying and fabricating, you still greatly affect a community and society at large in the way that a murder would. Yeah. Without her, with her being fine and alive, as you said, don't go jogging. It's terrified. People think Latinos are going to kill them. So even though no one died, she killed a lot of the faith that these people had in their community.
Yeah, exactly. And for whatever kicks she got or whatever delusion she was under, it was definitely, just one of those cases where you're like, oh, this is like a fake kidnapping. And then when you start researching it, you just see all of the ripple effects that come out from it.
How soon after she gets out of prison do you think we see her on Dateline in 2020 giving her side?
Oh my God. Oh, absolutely. There was like that
right?
woman Casey Edwards, who did that. She's all over the, I think that's her name, like all over the TV now, being like, it
Yeah.
was never me that killed my
Oh, the
child.
baby,
And
Casey.
yeah,
Yeah, I know
yeah,
what
in
you're talking about. Yes,
Florida. And
yes.
she's
Yeah,
definitely been doing the rounds. So she now has
yeah,
this like creepy, weird celebrity status. And
yeah,
yeah, and I guess the way that the media goes and true crime goes, then yeah, she's always going to be I'm sure she'll be able to get interviews booked
yeah.
very easily.
It's interesting when sympathy and empathy become take advantage of, manipulated to a point where, again, it's in Murdoch right now. Oh, please pity me. That lady who was driving and said, "My kids were kidnapped by 2 black men," and meanwhile she
Yeah.
drove the car into the water. It's just good grief. It's taking advantage of people. This is just harsh. And
Yeah.
on the level of, maybe not the level of actually killing someone, but you have the components there mentally.
There, just to go to that, just one last like level.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So that was the case of Sherri Papini. Thanks for listening this week. And as we said, next week, since that should be the ending of the Murdoch case, which is literally being called the case of the century. Like I've seen people on Facebook actually traveling down to go sit in the courtroom for a day or two just to watch this.
Yeah.
So we're going to go over and what new information has come out since then. And so stay tuned for that. But otherwise, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week. Listen to you next week. I don't know.
I'll hear you next week.
We'll be hearing you next week. We haven't come up with a tagline yet. We'll do something.
Yeah.
Anyway, our Patreon is up. We still haven't put up anything yet. Stay tuned for that. But otherwise, check out the show notes for any of the links that you might be interested in this case. And see you next week. Thank you. This episode was sponsored by The Creek Killer, Book 1 in the Harriet Harper thriller series written by me, Dominika Best. What would you do if you read the police found your body in a creek? Find out in The Creek Killer, available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me and listening to this episode. If you like my show, please give me a rating and review. It helps other listeners find this podcast. Follow Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit thebeststorytellingnetwork.com, where you'll find show notes, my books, links to social media, and much more. Join my Patreon for special subscriber perks, like 2 extra exclusive episodes a month and a Q&A with me at patreon.com/The Deviant Mind Podcast. Until next time.